this book, well, there's many you could choose from. Positive characteristics. One again is the writing of the author. So we're looking in this panel for the best writing in Scottish history. That we can deliver, that both academics and non-academics, a general audience, can enjoy the quality of the writing while being underpinned by that kind of rigorous historical research, which we're also looking for. And this book delivers that, both of those things, in spades. And one of the ways it does that is that because the author is drawing on his own family history and his own tussles, as it were, as an individual, with a very complicated and what we might call a difficult history, it gives the text a kind of dynamism and really sort of draws you into that story as him as an individual, but also the generations of his family that came before him.
My family keeps archives. The papers there document our forebears' activities in the Caribbean, most of them carefully annotated by my historian grandfather. And when I read them in the cellar of the old house in Ayrshire, I knew that the story they contained had to be brought to light. I felt it wrong to keep the history from the descendants of the enslaved people who had worked and died on our plantations in Tobago and Jamaica. Most of the wider family, including my own children, knew nothing of this past. What I discovered in those papers profoundly challenged my assumptions about who I was, about the history I'd been taught, and about Britain today. The Fergusons were wealthy, well-educated and influential. They were connected to some of the most powerful in the land, including the politicians on either side of the 40-year-long public debate over abolition of slavery and the slave trade. The individuals who I've come to know through their letters were humane and generous in their dealings in Britain. It is more than uncomfortable to realise that, were it possible to erase their West Indian business ventures and the great moral disaster that enabled those, you might find some likeable, even admirable people. But what they did, along with their partners, the Hunter Blairs, left a legacy still toxic, still harming people 180 years after emancipation in the British Caribbean.
Heading towards the Forth and Lothian, they would have listened to songs at their campfires, preparing them for the mysterious land of Saxine, a term that meant for them both Northumbria and England. The exploits of popular heroes and supermen like Finn McCool, as well as tales of the deeds of their own ancestors, would have been recited aloud and would have suppressed their fears at the terrible upcoming danger, and cultivated their excitement as they were encouraged to seek fame, glory and enrichment. Many would have probably had very little choice but to join the hosting, yet at the same time this would be one of the few opportunities most of them would ever have to rise materially and socially through the acquisition of precious jewellery, livestock and exotic slave girls. It may have also been seen as a chance to attract the attention of new patrons. For those who survived and returned to their localities, these expeditions would have become the source of their most valued and shared memories in later years. In popular terms, this was what it meant to be Scottish in the 11th century.
This is a pioneering study. It is the first book to really tackle the subject of the king and his kingship in the late 11th century. There's been numerous short studies in the past, but this is the first one that is a full monograph-length study, and it really exposes a lot of the fallacies in the way in which Malcolm III has been looked at in the past. So you're able to build something that is rounded, something that is comprehensive, and something that is, most definitely a weighty tome.
To his eager champions, Graham was and remains a hero, and for the rest of us, as Carlyle reminds us, great men are profitable company. We cannot look, however imperfectly, upon a great man without gaining something from him. Yet the title of hero applied to Graham is not without its appeal. Heroes act alone, without endorsement, guided by a moral compass to pursue a single-minded vision, and are discouraged neither by defeat, vilification, or shame. Careless of approval and the admiration of their peers, the hopes of reward, the promise of retroactive affection or some other emotional compensation, such individuals prize only their sense of honour and fulfilment. There is no doubt that Graham met many of these criteria, and at a time of precious few heroes, despite his flaws, paradoxes, and downright contradictions, he set the standard for integrity and personal courage.
Slaves and Highlanders by David Alston, which is a fascinating and important account of the Scottish Highlands and its societal, cultural, and of course economic engagement with the West Indies and the slave trade and slavery in that period. But I think what's really interesting about Alston's work and this book in particular are two things. One is the way in which he captures individual stories of families and real people who come to life on the pages of that period, but also how he tracks through the legacies of that into contemporary Highland and Scottish society more broadly. And I think those things taken together have really produced a very important account for our understanding of our sort of national engagement with slavery and the slave trade and how we might want to deal with that today.
Near to Plantation Cromarty, on the Corentine coast of Berbice, was Plantation Kiltern. It was created by George Rainey, who would later clear the island of Raasay of its people, along with his older brother Gilbert and their cousin Gilbert Robertson, the son of the parish minister of Kiltern on the Cromarty Firth. The leading Caribbean writer and political thinker, Jan Carew, who died in 2012 at the age of 92, was a descendant of both slaves and slave owners at Kiltern. And Carew's mother was a Robertson. He remembered that his great-grandmother had said this: "There are ghosts in our blood, and we're lucky, because the lowliest, the ones who suffer most in the world of the living, are always top dogs in the spirit world. We are blessed with the blood of the most persecuted folk on earth: Africans, Caribs, Portuguese Jews, French convicts from Devil's Island, Highland Scots, and the Lord alone knows what else." This was a generous comment on the Highland Scots who, like the Robertsons and the Raineys, had come to the Guyana to exploit others. If we acknowledge the truths of our history and listen to what is on the other side of the silence, I believe we too can hear the most human of these voices.
The Pippins and Pupines that Mary had in her care were not only dressed in different outfits, but were also provided with new garments by her court tailor. They were, in fact, dolls. These infantry dolls might have been kept by Mary de Guise as mementos of her daughter's childhood, or brought back from Mary from France as nostalgic reminders of her girlhood there. But 14 or more dolls seems to suggest something more than a sentimental attachment. Their interchangeable wardrobes indicate that these dolls were dressed and redressed. Moreover, their new clothes were not fashioned from the redundant scraps in the tailor's rag bag, but from cloth inventoried because of its value. They must have had some purpose in court culture.
Although it's about Mary Queen of Scots, it's also about the author's sort of history as a sort of community textile worker and artist herself. And she sort of goes on a journey with Mary. And you know, I think for me, as I'm a modern historian of the 20th century, dabbled in the late 19th century, but I know nothing about this period. So I learned a great deal. I liked the sort of reflective nature of it. and that the author was sort of reflecting on her own practice as a textile artist and her own history and all the sort of community arts-based work she's been involved in, and then kind of connecting that to Mary Queen of Scots' story. And we see a different side of Mary in this book, I think, from what the sort of cliche tropes about her that are, she stayed in every castle that there is in Scotland and every grand house. We get a sense of who she was.
The seed from which this book grew was planted in Darjeeling in the foothills of the Himalayas. I have had a long love affair with India, and on a visit to this beguiling region, I discovered to my astonishment that the first person to grow tea in Darjeeling was the Scottish doctor Archibald Campbell. Campbell was the son of a gentleman, but as the third son, and being neither an heir or a spare, he had to make his own way in the world. He graduated in medicine at Edinburgh University and joined the East India Company, which eventually sent him to establish a sanatorium and hill station that would provide the White Sabs with temporary relief from the sweltering heat of Calcutta. A keen amateur botanist, Campbell planted China tea bushes in the garden of his Darjeeling estate. Campbell's tea thrived, and within a decade other Brits had followed his example, and the tea gardens sprouted all over Darjeeling's hillsides. Intrigued, I began to read and inquire. Very quickly I discovered that an extraordinary proportion of the men who caused tea to become the favourite drink of half the world were Scots.
This is a very new book. It's written in the first person. It's lively and it's hugely informative, and it's about the involvement of the Scots in the tea trade. And Les manages in, I would have thought, a pretty mundane subject to bring a whole lot of new information about this. Fascinating material in terms of the characters involved, in terms of the place of tea in Scottish history, Scottish social life, and brought out in chilling detail, actually, is the way in which tea planters treated their workers out there in the tea groves, if you like. And so while it's a nice friendly topic, clinking China teacups and all the rest of it, the other side of it is ugly.